Mitch, welcome to the podcast, man.
Thank you for having me, brother. Looking forward to having this conversation with you today.
Yeah, I was on your podcast, Dad Nation. You got a really good thing going, man. Really cool. Why don't you give us a little bit of a synopsis just about kind of your mission and what you're all about?
Yeah, so typically what I do is I help career-driven men reclaim their home, their health, and their happiness. And I do that through media and mentorship. If you go on the website, one of the parts of our vision is to help 500,000 men restore their families and their relationships through media and mentorship. When I say media and mentorship, I mean we've got the Dad Nation podcast, like you just talked about. We do coaching. We have an online program called the High Performance Husband. But at the end of the day, the whole mission is really to help men show up as powerfully at home as they do at work. How
Hmm.
to, really define success at home and to lead their homes well, to show up powerfully. And we talk about the three big areas we really spend a lot of time on is your marriage or your key relationships, your overall fitness, and then your mindset. Within mindset, there's the emotional stuff, the self sabotage, you name it, the psychology, limiting self belief. So we get into it all, but a lot of the time we serve men who have been in situations where they've achieved some kind of professional success,
Hmm.
and maybe in their personal life they've been struggling a little bit, feeling disconnected from their spouse, feeling like they're disconnected from their children, or maybe gained some weight, got a bad health diagnosis, or struggling with their purpose or their passion, or even maybe some limiting self beliefs or self sabotage. And so those are the three areas kind of we really love to dig into.
Yeah, yeah, so good. So I want to jump into all of that, but I want to ask you, for men in general, like, and especially, I think especially if dads, like you and I became fathers right around the same time. We were texting back and forth because I think when you went to Portugal, was it with your kid?
Yeah, when he was
Is that
7
right?
months. Yeah.
And that was like right before we went to Italy with Judah, who was 10 months at the time. And I was like, I don't know, man. And you're like, dude, it's great. We just did it for 3 weeks in Portugal. It was great. So you gave me a little confidence there. And we had a great trip. You were right. So I want to ask, maybe through the lens of dads, why is it so hard to be a dad today? Because I feel like dads are tired. Dads are out of shape, like you're talking about. A lot of dads don't feel like they're able to make enough money to provide for their family and give the kids the life that they want them to have. Why is being a father so difficult?
So, man, that's a great question. And you know what, Cynthia, I don't think anyone's ever even asked me that question, which sounds funny, but that's a fantastic question. And I think we find it difficult for a couple different reasons. Number one is I think that we don't necessarily even understand what a healthy masculine man and how he should show up in the world today, let alone in the world, but let alone in his home and in his family, as a father, as a husband. So there's a lot of confusion around the definition. I think there's a lot of confusion around the role. What purpose do I serve? When some parts of society would say that I don't really matter, that's a big part of it. And I think too, we're living in a world where we're constantly comparing ourselves to everyone else's highlight reel, and I call it the gap trap. And essentially what we fall into is this idea of like looking to others to define success for us. So I could choose to look into the future and compare myself, my fatherhood, my husbandship, my entrepreneurial journey, you fill in the blank with whatever it is that you're getting caught in, and we compare ourselves to some ideal picture in the future, but we don't even know what that looks like. We have no metric for that. Or we compare to our brother-in-law or our boss or our neighbor, and we're always looking to, well, when I get a boat like they have, or when I get the house like they have, or when my marriage looks like theirs. And so what happens is we're constantly looking outward, and we fall into that gap way of thinking versus looking backward. And I love, I always with my clients, I always say the acronym AMB, right? Always measure backward. And so we want to look backward into the gain and then say, what have I accomplished in the past 6 months or a year, or where have I come from? What are all the things? I have a beautiful family, I have a beautiful marriage, I have a career, a house, whatever. And so here's the thing though, Cynthia, is either way we're going to get into the future, we're going to get there, right? But the
Yeah.
version of you that gets there You can either get there by comparison, by falling into that trap of constantly striving for that carrot, and you can show up exhausted and stressed out, or you can get there by measuring backward and celebrating every tiny victory, and then understanding that, and then defining success for yourself to
Hmm.
understand what does it look like in me and my house, our home, to be successful, not just at work, right,
Yeah.
but at home. And I think there's so many blurred lines. And so I guess to answer your question is, in summary, is yeah, is the comparison trap, but then also the lack of clarity around our purpose and how we show up today as a modern man. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean, I love the gap in the gain concept. I was just teaching some of my clients about that because for helping guys quit porn, it's a very relevant idea. And shout out to Dan Sullivan, Ben Hardy, who obviously popularized that idea there. It's an amazing, amazing concept. Um, Makes a lot of sense. I never really thought about it in this context, but as dads, you're right. There is like we get constant messages of what a dad should look like, what they should do between social media or the people in our lives that we're comparing ourselves to. I also wonder if there's a little bit of kind of like the gap in gain, but reverse direction, because I know sometimes we get messages from people that are older than us that are like, oh, being a dad's easy, or you just do this, or back in my day, da da da. You kind of get that, like, you get an ideal. It's still the same idea, but I guess the ideal comes actually from a previous time when you didn't have to battle with technology and social media with your kids, and you weren't constantly eating processed food because it was cheaper, but you needed the processed food because you don't make as much money because your dollar gets inflated, and just all that kind of stuff. Like, there's modern day issues that maybe a generation or two previous wouldn't have even had, and that can sometimes play into that gap thinking as well, right?
Of course. Yeah, of course. And I would say, Sathia, you think about it like this, and this is an exercise I'll walk through with my clients. It's like, so I just call it the life report card exercise. And you may have heard other variations of this, but at the end of the day, when we think about, we were raised in an education system that says you need to get straight A's and everything. Like when I brought my report card home as a child, from grade kindergarten to grade 12, and then into college, the whole point is if I got a C or a D, it was like, what happened?
Mm-hmm.
And so we've been conditioned to get A's in everything, to be excellent in everything. And so what happens then is we grow up, we go out, we get a mortgage, we get a family, we get career, we've got pressures that start to pile on, but we still believe this narrative that we need to be an A in everything. And so I just don't necessarily think that that's achievable. And what we do is we end up sabotaging and stressing out and being anxious because we're trying to be all things to all people. And
Yes.
so the exercise is to really go through your life and say, where are you okay with being a B? Where are you okay with being a C? And dare I say it, there might be some things you might to let go of and actually be an F in for this season, and that's totally okay because we're all doing good things. But the question that really seems to resonate with a lot of my clients, it's like, what good things in your life do you have to eliminate to make room for the best things? Right?
Mm.
Or like, what in your life is going to get your automatic yes? Because for every yes you give someone, someone else is getting a no. You understand what I mean? And so you have to be very clear and understand, what am I okay with just letting go for a season? When I had my son, Jet, I didn't have time to train 6 days a week, 2 hours in the gym. You know what I mean? My wife had a C-section. I had to take care of him. I still had a career, a business to run. And so I had to go from an A plus to maybe a B plus in my fitness.
Yeah.
And so you go through essentially do an audit of your life and your time and your energy, and then just give yourself permission to understand that in this season, we got to shift some things around. And so I think the combination of us striving for some unrealistic measure of success, because again, we come from that, it's in our wiring, and then also looking at, while simultaneously doing that, while also looking at everyone else's seemingly perfect life on
Yeah.
Instagram, it makes it real hard to wrestle with that tension, right? So
Yeah.
that's what I would say.
How do you know when to lower your expectation in an area? Obviously, your wife had a C-section, you got a little one. I think it's obvious there that okay, you're not going to hit the gym 6 days a week. What about when you're in those seasons though, where maybe I don't know, maybe life is just kind of normal and it's ticking away, And this is a question we get from our guys sometimes as well. It's just like, there's a lot of good things. There's my Bible study, there's my soccer team, I have a family, I'm involved in church on the worship team, I run a business, or I'm a leader at my church or at my organization, or whatever. I'm climbing the ladder, I'm active, in the community. I'm juggling all these different things. And how do I know in this season what to prioritize and what to deprioritize?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, and I think it's really just a matter of having that conversation with you and your partner, and I don't know how old your kids might be, but if you're listening, you have older kids, having that conversation as a family, or if you have young, really, babies or whatever, having that conversation with your spouse and saying, what does success look like for us? We're not going to look outside. We're not going to look. Maybe success for my neighbors means having our kids in 3 different sports and we're out 7 nights a week. Maybe for us in our home, we're actually going to take our kids out because we value quality time, because that's what success looks like for us. Family nights 2 times a week, dinner around the table, you name it, right? But we go back to that understanding of like, we go back to that trap of comparison. And so the question is, how do you define? You need to define success within your own home and within your own life. And I think when we don't do that, that's where the problem is, because it's different for everybody, right? Success for you, Sathia, looks entirely different than what it looks like for me. And
Yeah.
that's why, someone asked me a little while ago about, what I think it looks like to live a healthy life. And they wanted strategies. And I said, I mean, I could tell you lots of different ideas, but I just want to give a preface here, first of all, to say this was my way. There are millions of ways. And so don't take what I am saying you should do and then apply it to your life, because then we fall right back into that trap of comparing ourselves to someone else and stretching to make a system fit that doesn't work, right? And so
Hmm.
I would say for me, it's hugely important to define success. And if you're interested, I can give your clients or your listeners just a quick framework that I use
Please.
to help.
That'd be great.
And I just call it the prime success filter. That's it. And the word prime, it stands for well, each letter in that word stands for a step in the process, right? So PRIME. And the reason why we do this is because, like we're talking about, we all want to be content and fulfilled, right? But everyone else is defining success for us. And so this filter is a way of anchoring you to your values, to your vision, to your freedom, not someone else's idea of success, right? So the first one is personal. So this has to be your definition of success,
Hmm.
right? So these are the filters we're going to run through. The second one is relevant. It has to align with what truly matters to you in this season, key in
Hmm.
this season, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Intentional. You have to use it. It has to be an intentional action, something that requires you to take action on. Number 4 is measured. Okay, this is kind of similar to the SMART goals, measurable, right? Can I measure this, quantify this for success? This is huge for us as men, right? And then 5th one, evolving. It must grow with you as you grow, and so basically what we do then is we take our success statements, and I have clients write their success statements. So, and a success statement could start with something as simple as, I'll know I'm being successful when dot
Hmm.
dot dot, right? And then you run that thing through the prime filter. And so for you, it might be, listening today, it might be, I'll know I'm being successful when I can consistently exercise 3 times a week. I'll know I'm being successful when I can power down my phone at 7 p.m. and spend quality time with my wife. I'll know I'm being successful when I can go 7 days without snapping at my kids.
Hmm.
I'll know, and then you basically essentially define what success looks like for you as a man, husband, father, and write them out. Could be 5, could be 10, but you run them all through your prime filter, and then essentially define it for yourself. Because that way, when you start to get stressed out and anxious because your life doesn't look like this person's, or you're wondering if you're actually doing well, you go back and be like, okay, am I being successful? Yeah, according to what I said, for me in our home, I am being. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And so I think the $1 million question there is, like, do you have a cadence for how often you're revisiting this? Because obviously seasons change, and yeah, or what happens when you do even reach success in that area? Let's assume it was something attainable, like maybe numbers are always easier, right? Like you want to earn a certain income in your career and then you hit that. So then do you go back and you kind of run everything through the filter again and redefine success?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how ambitious you are and how evolving your life is, right?
True.
We go through seasons where your life looks different every quarter. Other times it doesn't change for a year. And depending on who's listening, it could look different for you. So I would say a couple different cues for you. It could be time to revisit your, success filter. Is that you starting to feel you're starting to feel kind of stressed out or anxious or confused about where your purpose, your passion is, or whatever. If you're starting to feel, or if you've already met some of these goals that you've set, okay, well, let's look back at them and say, okay, well, you talk about income. Well, my goal was to make 200K, in this last year. Okay, well, I did it. All right. What's the new level of success for me this year? Is it 250? Is it 220? Is it 300? And the great thing about this is it, and this is why that fifth step, evolving, it has to evolve with us. And so we're constantly kind of going back and tweaking and evolving as we go. And so it could be, I mean, I have guys who look at this every single week because they really wrestle with their contentment, and they really want to know that they're staying focused. Other guys visit it once every 6 months.
Sure.
So it's really up to you. But it is a really great anchoring tool, because especially, the masculine is driven by accomplishments, by mission, excellence, all those different things. So we want to be able to quantify success naturally. I mean, this is how we get paid for it at work, or we build businesses, or you name it. We fix things all day.
Yeah.
And so this is a really great way at making the intangible now tangible, right? Because this is where so many men struggle, is they can quantify success at work, but when they come home, the same rules don't apply, and so then they flounder, right? And so this is something that can help you wrap some strategy around. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. So I'd love to run through it like real time because I agree with that 100%. I know for me as a business owner, I know if I'm being successful. We got KPIs, there's revenue, there's margins, there's whatever. Very, very easy. I think at home, am I being a good dad? Less easy to quantify, and maybe something you don't even want to quantify necessarily, because you could say it's like, oh, I want to spend 45 minutes with my kid every day, but that may not be enough, right? Because I could be with my kid for 45 minutes, but I could be on my phone the whole time, right? Like there's some specificity there, and that's where your filter is so helpful. Can we run through this like as a dad? If we want to we want to outline some success criteria for me as a father. What would it look like for me to use the prime filter?
Yeah. So I would say, if you want to think about your marriage, right? Or you said as a dad. So let's think about you as a dad. So if you want to determine if you are successful, so your definite, so first one, personal, right? It's got to be personal to you. What does it mean to you? Because like you said, you have kids, who every kid is different, right? And so it's got to be your definition of success, not mine, not the neighbors, not your brother-in-laws, whatever. And so for me, it might be, okay, I want to, uh, like, I'll use your example, spend 45 minutes a day with my son. Okay, that's my definition, right? It's not yours. I'm gonna take that one, make it mine. Is it relevant? Does it align with what truly matters to me now? Well, yeah, I think it does, because I want to be a good father. I mean, I dedicated my life to it. Right? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? That
Yeah.
ain't a podcast. So, yeah, it's very relevant to me. Is it intentional? Right? I use it to choose and act on purpose. Yeah, it's going to require some intentionality for sure. It requires me to take action on this thing. It's not that something can happen for me. It's not my wife doing it. It requires me to be intentional. So yeah, I'm going to actually have to get home from work, put my phone down, sit on the floor, and spend some quality time with him.
Mm.
Is it measurable? Yes. Yeah, it is. I can say, I took 45 minutes each and every day, and if that was the time I allotted for, then that's great. Now, the thing is about this is 6 months from now, it might be different, or I might have another child who's higher needs, and it might need to be 60 minutes, or another child who doesn't have such high time needs, and maybe it's 30 minutes, right? And then the fifth one is evolving, right? Does it grow with me as I grow in my fatherhood and my relationship? Yeah, this can evolve for sure, and it should. So it meets all of that criteria. And then after, maybe a month, I'll ask myself, is 45 minutes, so my statement then is, I'll know I'm being successful when I spend 45 minutes a day with my son, right?
Yep.
Now, after 3 months, 4 months, I ask myself, am I still being successful? But how's our relationship? Are we still connected? Does he still feel loved? Does he still feel like a priority? Do I feel connected to him? Ask yourself some of those questions and then go back and say, is this still relevant? Right?
Mm.
Is this still measurable? Is this still evolving? Does it need to evolve even more? Does that make sense? That's kind of how I'd work through it.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah, really, really helpful. And I like that because I think it's very, yeah, it's specific, it's attainable. You're kind of setting the parameters yourself anyway. Yeah, so it makes a lot of sense. You used a word a couple minutes ago, contentment. Kind of talked about like this tying into guys being able to experience contentment in their lives. And I know you're working with high level execs. I can tell you as a business owner who's been in rooms with some, pretty high level people. I've been a lot with a lot of business owners in general. This whole contentment thing is very important. And I think you and I have ministry backgrounds, and certainly in Christian context in the church, contentment is another thing that we're all kind of after. We know it's in Jesus, and at the same time, we know that you can't just kind of throw out the Christianese and say it's all in Jesus. There's got to be some practicality to this. So I have several questions about this, but I will lead with the first, which is why, as men, do we find ourselves in these traps of something like starting a business or climbing the corporate ladder? We usually do these things, sure, for accomplishment and achievement and to step into our calling. But most guys I speak with are very conscious of being able to provide for their family, giving opportunities to their kids that they didn't have growing up. We're always very conscious of those things. And yet somehow it seems that so often the case is we build our empires and then we forget to bring our families along for the way. Why do we do this?
Oh, dude, that's such a big question. I wish we had 17 hours for this. No, it's so good. I think a lot of people make the mistake in thinking that contentment equals easy.
Hmm.
If you're content, you can be content with a chaotic life. Just because contentment doesn't equal an easy life. But I think we often make that mistake and we say, well, life isn't easy, so I must not be content, or this situation, running this business isn't easy, so I'm not content. My marriage is having conflict, so I'm not content. No, no, no. We have to. I mean, adversity is part of the game. Challenge is part of the game. I love the phrase, choose your hard. And I was actually on an interview just a couple hours ago when we were talking about this. It's like, you know what? Having being overweight is hard. Being in great shape is hard. Having a lot of friends is hard. Having no friends is hard. Building a business and being an entrepreneur is hard. Working for someone else is hard, right? Having having an amazing marriage is hard. Divorce is also hard, right? And so it's this idea that we fall into this trap of thinking that life should be easy. And it's a fallacy that we believe. David Data in the book, The Way of the Superior Man, he says, um, he calls it the great masculine error, is that one day it's going to be easy and I'll be able to sit on the shore with my little umbrella drink and it's all going to make sense. But that fallacy is what keeps us striving and pushing and pressing and never really fully content because we're waiting for some magical time. Again, in that gap frame of thinking, right? And so I would say the first step in understanding your contentment is not waiting for it to be easy. Um, when we talk about our passion, what are you passionate about? I mean, that really at the end of the day, and you would know this, I know in your faith background, but the word passion, derived from, Christ and on the cross and his suffering, and we could get into all that another time, but essentially you can ask yourself is what are you willing to suffer for? Those are the things that you're passionate about, as Christ suffered, right? And so we
Mhm.
need to understand that you could be completely engaged in your passion, completely in business and in marriage and all that stuff, and then feel like you're not content. But you have to understand where are you looking outward, right? So that's the big thing is understanding that contentment doesn't mean easy. And I think a lot of people also, I think they when we talk about their identity, you talked a little bit about that. Our identity is always shifting, right? and your identity shifts. Like, we know that fundamentally speaking, when we get married, our identity shifts. When we have children, our identity shifts. So many different times. And so, to answer that question, what does contentment look like? I think is to ask yourself, am I engaged with what I'm passionate about? Who am I today versus who I want to be, right? And this is let me park here for a second, because this is a big point that resonates with a lot of my clients. So I have all of my guys write a eulogy, right? Because we must begin with the end in mind, because we can't get away from the truth. You know this. Um, and so Stephen Covey, in his book Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, right? Chapter 2 is dedicated to beginning with the end in mind. Napoleon Hill, one of the greatest thought leaders of our time, beginning with the end in mind. My transformation story, which I didn't share, but came in the middle of a funeral, when the minister said, "Are you living a life worthy of imitation? If you were to die today, would you be proud of the legacy that you left?" And at that time, Cynthia, my marriage was on the verge of divorce. I was 60 pounds overweight. I was 100 grand in debt, and I was medicating with drugs and alcohol, trying to keep up. Everything was crumbling around me, and I was faced with my life and where I was headed. And so when I was getting ready to sing the last song in that funeral, and I overheard the pastor ask that question, I thought, I am not living a life worthy of imitation. If this was my funeral, no one would say, I want to imitate the marriage he had. I want to imitate the bank account he had, or whatever, his health, his fitness. So that was what started with me. And so what I did was I began with the end in mind. And so this is what I do with clients. And so that is where our tension lies, is the man we are today versus the man that we know we could be if we went all in. And within that gap, that's where the anxiety comes from, the frustration, the stuff that eats us alive at night when we put our head on the pillow. It's like, man, I could have been there for her, or I could have showed up for my kids. And so when we talk about contentment, is, have you really considered, what do you want to be known for? Have you began with the end in mind? When it's all said and done, because spoiler alert, one day you will take your final breath. And when you're taking that last breath, what will you be thinking about? The businesses you built, or the way you showed up as a father, or the way you showed up as a husband? And so when we talk about contentment, it's like starting with the end in mind, getting very clear on what's most important to you, and then starting to live in alignment with that thing. But the vast majority of us don't understand what that is. 90% of my clients, I ask, what do you want? And they have absolutely no idea,
Yeah.
because they've spent so much time building their business, right?
Yeah.
And actually,
Yeah.
and when they finally do understand what they want, they see that their actions aren't actually in alignment with what they say that they want.
Hmm.
Because I'll say, well, you say you want to have a wife that respects you and loves you, and you want to be connected with your kids, but you work 16 hours a day. How does that work? And so we bring clarity, and we get honesty. We seek out the truth. And so it's this understanding of beginning with the end in mind, that eulogy exercise, getting real about what you want, and then taking those action steps to become that man. And going back to what I was saying, that won't be easy, right? And it's not, and that's never been the point. It's actually going to be difficult. But if you want to be truly content, then you have to live in alignment with that end vision of your life is going to look like. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I actually read the Seven Habits of Highly Effective People for a year straight. I just, as many times as I could get through it in a year. That book changed my life. And the eulogy exercise that you're talking about was very impactful the first time I did it. I don't think I did it every single time I read through, but highly recommend it. I love that you do that with your clients, because I do think it puts things into perspective. I want to play devil's advocate a little bit, because I've heard a couple people recently say this. I was actually shocked to hear people say this, but I'll play advocate and pretend that I believe what they believe, which is, why should I care about something I'm going to think about at the end of my life when it's only a season, it's only a snapshot in time? Like, if I know, and this was in the context of building a business. So somebody said, I'm a businessman. I build businesses. That's what I do. Why would I think the context of this conversation was, why would I have kids? I know I'm going to regret having kids later, but is that a good enough reason to do it now, when that later season is just going to be a season at the end of the day? what would you say to somebody who maybe hears the eulogy exercise and is like, "Ah, oh, dude, that's just whatever. Like that's just my death. It's one moment. I'll be dead already, or it's the last 20 years of my life. Does that really matter in comparison to the first 60?" What would you say to somebody who doesn't see the value of it that way?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, Cynthia. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I'm like, you will have to account for all this, right? Not
Mm,
me. So a lot of guys will be like, well, that's your thing you're projecting onto me, or your tenacity, or whatever. Because obviously, I'm really passionate about it, and we are in alignment with that. I'm like, hey, if it's not your passion to have kids, and if it's not your passion to have a life full of love with a wife or whatever, and you want to rock a business and build it, and fine. If you want to live with regret, I mean, fine. That's up to you. But for me, um, that vision of the future is what determines my present action steps. You know what I mean?
mm,
Everything in my present is dictated by my vision of the future, right? And so if I don't have a clear picture of where I want to go and what I want to do, um, then what am I doing in the present? You know what I mean? Like we and the thing is, Thea, we get caught in this trap, and I call this the author's advantage. But we get caught in this trap thinking that our past, because of what happened to us, will shape our present, and this shapes our current situation. Well, we're just a victim, or this happened, blah blah blah, and then so we limit ourselves in the present, and then we just kind of fall into the future. We don't necessarily take control. We feel like life happens to us. We become victims, and we don't want to think about the future. We don't want to think about what's going on. Well, that doesn't matter right now. Well, yeah, it does, because if you don't take that seriously, your life could be very very different, right? We know that our life today is a direct result of decisions we've made 3 to 5 years ago, and if we want to be somewhere different in 3 to 5 years from now, we need to learn how to make different decisions, right? And so what I do, instead of thinking, well, this is what happened to me in the past, so this is all this is what this is going to look like, and then and limit my future, I flip that model on its head and say, I want to get a very very clear picture on my future and what I want, and defining success for me at the end of my life. What do I want to be known for? And then then basically taking that future and allowing it to dictate my my steps in the present. There's a book called 10x is easier than 2x, where Dr. Benjamin Hardy talks about this, and Dan Sullivan, another shout out,
yeah.
who dictates the present actions. And then I get to speak to my past and say, how can I bring what happened to me into alignment with my purpose, with where I'm going? And so it's a backwards way of looking at it, and that's essentially what I did. But someone who would say that, why does that matter? And again, I'm like, hey, you do you, man. But at the end of the day, for me, my future determines everything, because I will not live in regret one day. You understand what I mean? I was talking to my wife a couple days ago, or a couple weeks ago. We were taking the dog for a walk, and I said, I think this sounds kind of morbid, but I think I'm at the point where if I die tomorrow, I'd be content, because with what I've done, with even though my son's not even 2 years old, through the podcast, through my coaching, I have a business. He will know that I loved him wildly. He will
Mm,
know. He'll get a chance to hear my voice and my teachings through the podcast, and all those different things. And I've helped so many men, and I'm at the point now where I'm fully content with what I've been able to do. Now, if I didn't know into the future what I wanted, then I wouldn't be able to say that, right? I'd
mm,
keep striving,
mm.
because I wouldn't know what success looks like. So, I mean, yeah, I get a lot of people would say, well, why does that matter? Like, well, I guess I don't have a great answer, but it certainly matters to me, because I do think that the future determines everything in our present.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Makes perfect sense. Yeah, and I think when you factor in the faith-based perspective, it's not when we're talking about the future, we're not even just talking about our future here on Earth, right? Like
Exactly.
there's an eternal future that supersedes everything else we're doing anyway. And like you said, we have to give an account for what we did. So I think it makes a lot of sense. Why does the fitness piece matter here? So I can kind of I could see people are like, okay, yeah, you don't want to just be successful at work, you want to be successful at home, and that's more of a relational quality. Why does the body and good physical condition, like why is that one of three areas that you're focusing on with your clients? Why is it so important?
Oh man, so many areas we could go with this. But let me say this: physical exercise has very little, for me, has very little to do about muscles. You understand what I mean? It's so much more about my mind, my psychology, my emotions. Um, I tell business leaders all the time: you want to be a better leader, work out, and I'll explain to you why. There's a couple of reasons. What it does to us on a psychological level, and what it does to us on a neurological level. So when we work out, we know that there are essentially this giant cocktail of neurochemicals that are released when we exercise. Things like norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, you name it. All these things are released, and what happens is, it actively combats stress by lowering your cortisol levels. That's a big one. So it increases your capacity to handle stress. It improves cognitive function, which allows you to think more clearly under pressure, which allows you to stay focused for longer. It is a mood enhancer, makes you more positive, makes you more focused in that way, makes you more literally happy. Um, and there's so many other things, but when we talk about um, how to increase your capacity, not just at home but at work, I don't know about you, but I want to take advantage of all of those wins. And especially you think about, if me and you were working out in the gym, Cynthia, and I said, all right, I'm going to hit a PR in my squat. And if I go to a new height, or a new weight, if you will, that is probably the hardest thing I'm going to do all day. So I can take any sales call after that. I can lead any meeting after that if I've done that, right? And then number two is it psychologically sets me up for success for the rest of the day because I said yes to waking up and going to train. And what that does is it primes my subconscious mind to continue saying yes to the other commitments throughout the day, which takes me to the other point, which what happens psychologically when we exercise. Notice I haven't said anything about actual physical fitness yet. But when we talk about, especially as men, as husbands in the home, business leaders, this idea of self-confidence, right? So self-confidence, when we talk about how do I get more self-confidence, how do I gain it, the simplest way I can explain it, and I'm sure you've heard this before, Cynthia, but it's, are you keeping promises to yourself? Because if me and you were to say, if I said to you, Cynthia, I'll see you at 9 a.m. on Tuesday morning at Starbucks. And then Tuesday morning I showed up at 9:15. And the next week I showed up at 9:30. And the next week I showed up at 11. And the next week I didn't show up at all. You would start losing confidence in our relationship on that I would show up, right? There's no different than what happens with ourselves and within our own minds. Because what happens, Cynthia, is if I say I'm going to get up at 5:30 and I'm going to be at the gym by 6, and I don't do it time after time, even though no one else knows, I know. And so what happens in your mind is it starts saying things like, why would anyone else trust your word if you can't even trust yourself that you're going to get up and follow through?
Yeah.
Right? And so you lose rapport with yourself. You lose confidence in yourself. And so when we talk about exercise and how men love tactical strategies, all that stuff, it's a simple promise you can make to yourself where you can start showing up and actually stack wins. James Clear says, casting votes for the person you're becoming, right? So you're growing in self-confidence, which is going to translate hugely in how you show up both at home as a husband and as a father, but at work. You'll blow through your professional ceilings when you're showing up with way more self-confidence because you've been keeping your promises. Also, your norepinephrine, your serotonin, your dopamine levels are up. You got a greater capacity to handle stress, greater capacity to think. You're in a better mood, all those different reasons. It translates into every part of your life. That's why every single one of my clients gets a custom built training plan and a custom built nutrition plan, because this is a fundamental part of what it means to show up powerfully, I think, as a man, husband, father. And then there's also the physical benefits like losing fat and building muscle, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Even thinking about what we were just saying a few minutes ago, if you're trying to leave a legacy, you want to have longevity, you want to be making an impact in the latter years of your life. you can't do that if you die young. You can't do that if you're limited even with mobility or whatever it might be, whatever ailment or restriction you might have as you get older. I remember I had a mentor one time sit me down and say like, hey, I know that you are active and whatever. Don't lose that, because everything else that God's called you to is going to be limited by how well you take care of yourself physically. And I had never really thought, and I was like 25 at the time or whatever. I'd never really thought about it, but he's right. Like yeah, if you die young or if your health starts to deteriorate, it's going to impact your efficacy and what you're able to do, especially as life goes on. And I think that's a really big deal. So it makes a lot of sense. Marriage is another area that you really focus on. So guys who are crushing it at work, crushing it in their business, the marriage is struggling. For me, as somebody who has a coaching practice helping guys quit pornography, I'm especially interested in just what you have to offer here, because I think this is such a big area. And even now that I have a team, I have 7, 8 full-time people on my team, and I can see the difference in the people on my team when things are good at home, the marriage is healthy, they're getting along, versus when they're going through stuff. It does affect our performance and affects everything else. But something tells me you probably have a couple inches deeper to go on this. Tell me just a little bit about why marriage matters so much for men who want to be excellent and achieve everything God's called them to achieve.
Yeah, it's so good. Well, here's the thing, and I'll say this to maybe kind of wrap up sort of what you were saying, is marriage is one of the most unique things in that everything in your life could be going right, but if your marriage is going wrong, none of that matters. On the flip side, everything in your life could be going wrong, but if your marriage is going great, none of that stuff matters. It literally impacts everything you do. The person you marry is the most influential person in your life. Whether they support you, whether they, when you're going through seasons of conflict or tension, they can lift you up, they can pull you down, you name it. We're so massively affected by marriage. And that is, again, so when I talk about mindset, fitness, and marriage, is very strategic, because those are the three things that really impact you on a professional level. Right. And so I'm not an executive coach. I'm not going to teach you how to build your business. I'm going to teach you how to build everything else that actually is going to affect your business. Right. And marriage is the biggest influential factor in that. And I think, if for nothing else, the reason to have a great marriage is because it's such an influential part. And if you're concerned about your profession, when you come home, if you show up to work like you had said, and you're content and you're in a good place in your marriage, you're not going to be distracted. You're going to be so much more productive. You're going to be focused. You're going to be, you're going to show up more powerfully. But if you're in a fight and every time you go home, it's just like landmines and you're stressed out and you're anxious, well, you're going to show up differently at work, right? Massively. And so for me, it's hugely influential, and it's important that we get that dialed in more than anything else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. So where are you helping guys dial this in? What do guys typically need to focus on to get their marriage back on track?
Emotions.
Okay. Didn't even think twice about that one.
Let me unpack it for you. Here's some interesting statistics that might kind of make your listeners think. In the United States today, 7 out of every 10 divorces are initiated by women. In situations where the wife is also a contributing earner in the home, or she's educated, that number jumps to 90% of divorces are initiated by women. Now,
Wow.
of those divorces that are initiated, 80% of the time, the vast majority of the reasoning for this divorce is because a woman feels emotionally disconnected from their husband. What does that tell us? Well, that's a giant red flag, right? It tells us that we got some work to do in this area, and it's okay. It's okay that we struggle with connecting with our emotions, right? Let me unpack a couple more things for you. There's a psychological term called normative male alexithymia. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful, but if you actually break down the word alexithymia, it means to arrest or to stop, right? And so what that means is, normative, it's normal, right, for men, to arrest when it comes to talking about their emotions, right? So what this means is the psychological field recognizes that men in general, this is a part of the male experience, that when we're pressed to talk about our emotions, we don't even necessarily have the words to speak. We don't necessarily have the vocabulary like our wives do. And so that's why the most common challenge in marriage is, I feel like I'm married to a robot, or stop trying to fix me. I don't need a solution. Well, woman, I spent 10 hours today fixing things in my business. What do you mean I can't fix this? You know what I mean? And so
Mm.
there's this huge disconnect. And then let's talk about, that's where we're at today. But now let's look to our past. I mean, Cynthia, we're like 2 or 3 generations removed from extreme PTSD and trauma from the World War II, right? These men, millions of men came home with just unspeakable horrors that they experienced. And they didn't have a therapist. They didn't have a soft couch to sit on. They had the bottle, right? And the Legion, but we thank God that they sacrificed the way they did. And we're so thankful for that. But they didn't have the tools. And so then they raised sons, and the narrative was, hey, be a man, suck it up, stuff it, right? Deal with it. And then those boys raised men, and then with the same sort of narrative. And now we have tools and resources today, but we're still living just a few generations removed from some of the most traumatic things that we've ever seen as a human race, right? And so that, in conjunction with being in a culture where it's not normal for men to talk about how they feel because of this normative male alexithymia. Saying all that to say, hey, if you're listening to this and you have a hard time talking about your feelings, you're having a hard time opening up, and if you've ever heard your wife say, why can't you talk about your feelings, or I feel disconnected from you, understand that you're normal and this is a part of the male experience, but there are tools and resources that we can use to learn this, right? And
Yeah.
so just before I move on, I want to say this. I have a free gift for your listeners today. And we can talk about it after at the end, but it's just called the connection code, which is 50 questions to spark the fun and get the fire back in your relationship. And these questions are tried, tested, and true, that are literally, you can take them off the page. I'm giving it to you on a silver platter. They're questions that are going to help you connect with your wife on a deep emotional level, where she's going to feel connected with you. So I say all that to say, the biggest challenge, that beyond a shadow of a doubt, dude, is they don't know how to connect with their partners emotionally.
Wow. Okay. So thank you for the connection code giveaway as well, by the way. So we'll put a link in the show note for anybody that wants that. Get your hands on it. Highly recommend it. It's funny. It's really the first thing we deal with when guys are coming to us to quit pornography is the same thing: normative male alexithymia. It's the lack of emotional access, and it's crazy how much that contributes to issues relationally. I'm not surprised, like that you mentioned that, but even just vices, addictive behaviors, compulsions, bad habits, all of that stuff is actually driven by us numbing out our emotions. So what happens on the other side of this? Because I think, for like, I was that guy. I was the guy who had alexithymia, couldn't tell you, couldn't even name an emotion. And if I did, I felt it up here. I had no like attachment to my heart, really and truly. For somebody who hears that and is like, I don't want to be some soft, sappy guy who's touchy feely. I don't want to be the guy who sobs all the time and is crying. I um I don't see why I need to get in touch with my emotions. I seem to be doing fine or whatever. How do you help guys get past some of these maybe masculine stereotypes that would prevent them from immediately warming up to the idea that you're talking about here?
I would ask one question. Um, how's that working for you? How's that working for you in your marriage? You know what I mean? How's that working for you with your kids? When you hear those statistics about women, when you hear those statistics about divorce, we know it's not working. So again, let's start with the honesty, right? Now, if you're listening to this and you're completely happy in your marriage, and key point, you've asked your wife and she's completely happy,
Yes, both parties are happy. Yeah.
then fine. But if you're honest with yourself and your spouse is truly honest with herself, and you have that genuine conversation, and there's room to grow, then I think the answer would be to grow in that area. I mean, I call it modern masculinity. Modern masculinity is a combination of both. It's not the 30s, 40s, and 50s. This old dated narrative that you just make money, you show up, provide, and that's it. And it's not this super progressive, like everything about masculinity is toxic, get rid of the man thing. It's somewhere in the middle where it's like, how do you show up powerfully? How do you know your mission and be on a mission for your, in your business and your family? How are you, what I love the phrase, easy to love, hard to kill,
Mm.
how are you really in alignment with your purpose and your vision, but also creating space for your partner to express how she feels, being connected emotionally with your children, and really asking great questions and being able to sit in that tension of maybe with your wife not necessarily feeling okay and not shoving a solution down her throat, and not feeling like attacked because she wants to talk about her feelings, and you don't know how, so you get insecure. And so it's like living in that pendulum of being able to do both really well. And I think that's so critical, because it's not 1955, it's 2025, right? And times have changed. And so I think it's important. And as I'm here, Cynthia, I realized I didn't really answer your question when you asked about what can men do to connect, or what does that look like. I talked a lot about the problem, but if you want, I can actually give your men just a simple framework, and that they can use to like connect with their partners.
Let's do it.
Just questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And again, because I know we like strategies, we like tactics, and it's called the RISE conversation ladder. Okay. So I want you to think about rungs on a ladder, and it goes from layer to layer in conversation with your partner. So the first layer of questions and that's routine. This is the base of the ladder. This is the small talk that runs the house, right? It never really touches the heart. It's questions like, what time are you going to be home? You know, did you pay the water bill? What's for dinner? Now, these questions are important. They're tactical, right? They're on a functional level. We ask them, but it's not really getting you anywhere emotionally. I think we would all agree with that. The second level is information. Okay, so this is the next rung, and this is where we move from transactions to facts about your world. So this next layer is like, what happened at work, right? What did the teacher say at the parent-teacher meeting? What did your mom want when she called? Now, at this level, you're exchanging news headlines, if you will, from your day. It's better than nothing, but you're still reporting. You're not really revealing anything, right? And so this is information. It's like the on ramp, not the final destination. Okay. Then the fourth step is story. Okay. So this is where it starts to crack open a little bit. You start to connect with her. It moves beyond what happened to how it impacted you. Okay. It pulls emotion out of those facts. So this is where trust and empathy grow. So examples would be, how did that meeting make you feel? So now it's not about what time was the parent teacher meeting or what did they say. It's, how did you feel about what was said? you know
Mm.
or what was the hardest part about your day today, or what do you wish I understood better about what you're dealing with? So this is where you kind of drop your guard and give your wife permission to drop hers. Right now, this is where most men fall off. We don't get
Yeah.
to this point. We go R, I, and we stop before we hit F, right?
Yeah.
Because it requires us to turn off fixing mode. And we can't fix that because now she's talking about her emotions. So we don't go there. The fourth one is essence. E for essence. This is the final rung of the ladder. And this is where intimacy is born. Okay. This is where you're connecting with her on an emotional level. It's about meaning. Okay. The inner world that few people ever get invited to. So this is where she talks about her fears. This is where maybe her spiritual questions are. This is where her dreams come to life. So questions that might be the deepest level would be, what's been on your mind lately, or what's been on your heart lately that you haven't said out loud, right? What's one thing that you're praying for that you haven't told me about? What dreams keep tugging at you that you wish we talk about more? And another question that I really like is, what's one thing you'd love for our family to do in the next 5 years? It's simple, it's practical. But when she says, I want to feel close to you, this is what she's this is what she's talking about. She
Yeah.
wants you to ask deeper questions. But we keep asking dead end questions like, how'd you sleep? How are the kids? How's your day? And then you get these dead end answers and you get frustrated. It's like, well, you asked a dead end question. You ask the same question every single day. But here's the thing, the ladder only works if you climb. So you can practice this with your partner, right? So ask the surface level question, and then the information, and then so on and so forth, and get to the essence of it all. So that can be a helpful framework for your listeners. Uh, and you can use that in conjunction with the connection code to really go into greater depths. And that's not emasculine. That's not feminine. You're just connecting with her on a deeper level than you probably ever have.
Definitely, yeah, very, very helpful. It's a good framework, and it makes a lot of sense because I think, yeah, sometimes guys just need the tactical steps. Like there's a progression there, which is actually nice because when you talk about even climbing the ladder, when you first start out, you might not go all the way up the first time, right? Like you can work your way into it, get comfortable, and get better and better at it as time goes on. Do you have a suggested rhythm for when these conversations happen? This is like something I've even wrestled with. I can be like hyper structured and way too disciplined, and then my wife hates it because she doesn't like that there's no organic or impromptu kind of conversations happening. So we're definitely at a good balance now. We've been married for 5-6 years, so it's a little bit different. But I'm just curious if you recommend, I don't know, just how do you institute this with some regularity into a marriage?
Yeah. I could just get a snapshot. You being like, "Hey, honey, I have 6 strategic questions to ask you about your heart."
Yes.
You know?
I have 17 minutes. That's about 2.5 minutes per question. Let's go. Yeah.
Oh, so good. I would say, okay, number one, understand it's a skill. It's the art of conversation. And it's not like you don't know how to talk to her. You're just out of practice, right? And so take time and learn that skill again, because we've just been sitting, at that routine and that information level for so long that it feels a little bit daunting to get into the story and then the essence, right? So number one, have grace with yourself and understand, okay, I'm going to go into this conversation, I'm going to try it, and you might chicken out or it might go south. That's fine. That's one of hundreds of thousands of conversations you're going to have with her, right? It's
Yeah.
fine. She's just happy that you're talking to her. All
Yeah.
right, that's it. I mean, you're trying, which you weren't yesterday, right? Let's live in the
Yeah.
game. But then I think the big thing too is it's less about it's often about what you're talking about, but it's also about when you're talking about it,
Mm.
right? And so it's important to think about your environment. So my wife is a night owl. I am a morning person. I'm usually up at 5, training, whatever. By the time she gets up at like 7, I just, in my nature, because I'm firing on all cylinders, I'm like peppering her with questions about the budget. And it's, she's like, what are you, shut your mouth. Like, I don't want to talk to you right now. It's like, you're just so, and she always says, she jokes, she's like, the only communication before 9 a.m. is hugs. That's it. I don't want to talk, you know, and then in the same sense, she'll bring up these deep, like challenging questions at like 9 o'clock at night. And I'm like comatose at that point. Right.
Yeah.
And so we have windows. So for us, it's like from 12 p.m. to like 7 p.m. after lunch, to 7. That's like our sweet spot to have any kind of conversation or anything outside of like a date night or something we're going out. But I say that to say, like, when you're talking about sensitive conversation, right? Or you talk about money, you want to talk about sex, or you want to talk about whatever maybe has been, you know, sensitive for you in the past. Understand it's important to talk about. It's important to consider when you're having that conversation. Are you all rested, right? Are you fed? Is anyone hangry? Does anybody need snacks before we talk, right? Are the phones put down? Are the kids maybe with a sitter, or maybe they're put down, to sleep? What is the environment that we're in that's going to be conducive for this conversation? Because the last thing you want to do, trust me, and I've been there, I've made this mistake. And so for, you're listening as a man, we can get really practical about this. And, you might start thinking about this 9 o'clock in the morning, or on your coffee break, and you're like, okay, what questions am I going to ask her? And you hype it up. And if you're like me, you put it on a pedestal. You get to that moment and you're like, okay, I'm going to ask her these questions. You know what I mean? And then all of a sudden a kid starts screaming from the bedroom, or, she's on her phone and she's texting or something. You're getting frustrated because you put so much on this, right? There's so much pressure. And then all of a sudden she's not responding like you want her to. And you're like, I had this whole thing planned out and now you're not even talking to me. You said you always wanted to, and I'm just trying to, and then all of a sudden this turns into a fight, right? So I would say, understand, have grace with yourself, hold your expectation very loosely. I would say have no expectations for this. You might want to have hopes, you know, but expectations are tricky. And then practice it over time. Use some of the questions that we've been talking about, and then go at it that way. right? But the part of the strength in being a man is that driven sense of mission, that, whatever, we turn everything into a strategy. But that too, the shadow side to that is we can hyper focus on some of these things and put too much hopes or expectations around it, and build it up to be something it's not. And then all of a sudden she feels pressure now, which it's totally the opposite of what it should have been in the first place. And it's interesting, you're talking about this, because we know that, and I'm sure you've talked about this on your podcast, but women need to be connected with emotionally before they can open up to us physically. That's just the way we're wired. They're wired. We are the complete opposite. We need to be connected with physically, and then we can connect emotionally. You think about, like, after sex, like the pillow talk, about you, you could talk about your feelings then, but
Yeah.
it needs to come through the physical action. And so what happens is men can take this and then say, they can almost weaponize it and say, okay, well, if I ask these questions, then we're going to have sex tonight. You understand what I mean? So, like, let it go, let the expectations go, and understand that, this is a long game we're playing here. We're making deposits into this relationship.
Yes.
And if we're in debt, when we talk about this idea of relational currency, if we're in debt, then we're going to have to make a few deposits before we can even get to the place,
Yes.
where we're in a good spot. We're in the green, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Dude, makes so much sense. Yeah. Lots of wisdom, lots of frameworks, lots of practicalities. I love it. We will make sure there's links for everything in the show notes to the resources you mentioned, because I think our audience is going to love those. If guys want to find out more about you, Mitch, what you're up to, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I like to keep it real simple. I mean, I do three things. I have content, I have courses, and I do coaching. So the content is the Dad Nation podcast. You can eat that up. There's tons of great episodes there. If you like what you heard today, I'm sure you'll find something great there. I have listeners all over North America, so it's going to be great. Courses, I'm working on something called the High Performance Husband, which is really everything that I put in to teaching my one-to-one clients. So a lot of these frameworks I share today is in there. And then the coaching, of course, for the right person who wants to take action immediately. I'd be happy to talk about what that could look like. We have a community of men who are just on the same mission, really wanting to level up in their home, their health, and their happiness. And so if a lot of this is resonated with you and you feel a little fire in your gut, then let's connect. But otherwise, yeah, honestly, without sounding vain, you could just Google the Dad Nation, and you'll find me. You can check me out on YouTube, subscribe there if you want. But that's what I got going on, man.
Beautiful. Mitch, thanks for your time, man. Appreciate this.
Hey, thank you so much. And if you don't mind, I'd just love to leave your listeners with this quote that's been really resonating with me: is time is the only currency we spend without knowing the remaining balance. And so
Hmm.
we don't know how much time we have left. I could have 60 minutes. I could have 60 years. But in any case, I'm so thankful for your time, Cynthia, and I'm thankful to your listeners for listening to this conversation. It's not lost on me on how precious this asset is. And so thank you for your time today. Appreciate it, brother.
Likewise, man. It was great having you.